Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Katie Haldeman, Senior Project Manager at Sustainable Conservation. Welcome to the second webinar in our series, Climate Resilience from the Ground Up. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you to our generous sponsors, Environmental Science Associates, Holland and Knight LLP, Iron Horse Vineyards, Spotswood Estate Vineyard and Winery for supporting our Spring 2022 webinar series and sharing sustainable conservation's vision of stewarding our most precious natural resources for all Californians. For those of you who don't know, Sustainable Conservation works collaboratively on the stewardship of California's land, air, and water for the benefit of nature and people, with a particular focus on accelerating restoration to improve water resources and ecosystem functions. For today's presentation, we'll be focusing on habitat restoration in the context of climate resilience. Land stewardship and habitat restoration in California are not new, but recently there has been more emphasis on talking about wetland and waterway restoration and enhancement as a nature-based solution, a way that we can work with and enhance nature to build climate resilience. If you've been following what the California Natural Resources Agency and other state agencies have been working on, you may have heard these topics being discussed throughout the state. One of the priorities in California's climate adaptation strategy is to accelerate nature-based climate solutions and strengthen climate resilience of natural systems. Actions to achieve that priority include protecting, restoring, and creating coastal wetlands, restoring and enhancing rivers, mountain meadows, and reconnecting aquatic and terrestrial habitats. In the Resources Agency's Pathways to Conserving 30% of California's land and coastal waters by 2030, one of the categories of strategic actions is to expand and accelerate environmental restoration to stop and reverse biodiversity loss and build resilience to climate change. In the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy, wetlands are a priority nature-based solution, including coastal wetlands and salt marshes, living shorelines, rivers, floodplains, and mountain meadows. To give us some examples of what these nature-based solutions look like, we have 3 panelists who are working in different parts of California who will talk about what they do and the kinds of restoration projects that are being done in the area of California where they work. Okay, well, now I'm honored to introduce our 3 panelists. We'll be starting with, I believe, Trina Cunningham from the director of the MIDU Summit Consortium. Then we'll have Jessica Law, Executive Director of the Water Forum. Then we'll have Evan Sloan, Director and Regional Manager of the State Coastal Conservancy's San Francisco Bay Program. She'll talk about restoration on California's coast. Each of these panelists will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'll talk about what our Accelerating Restoration Program does to help increase the pace and scale of restoration project implementation. Finally, we'll have time for questions from the audience for all our panelists, and you're welcome to add your questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A box. If you have a question for a specific panelist, please direct your question to them. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please write something into the chat box, and Hannah from our team will help you out. The webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be shared with the registrants, and it will go on our website and our YouTube channel. Thank you all for being here. And with that, let's begin up in the Sierra Nevada mountains in the Feather River watershed with Trina Cunningham, Executive Director of the Mountain MIDU Consortium. So I'll turn it over to you, Trina.
Right, thank you, Katie, and thank you so much for this opportunity to be here today and to share a little bit of the work we're doing and the ideas shared within our tribal communities. And to begin with, I wanted to talk about my organization, the MIDU Summit Consortium, and I am the executive director. And the MIDU Summit Consortium was formed in 2001 when we realized in some meetings with the Forest Service and other entities that in order to protect one of our most sacred sites in our homelands, we needed to come together as tribal organizations, families, to do this. And so it was really set up to protect our homeland and to perpetuate our culture. And then in 2003, when PG&E went bankrupt, well, in 2001, when they went bankrupt, 2003, we found out that they were going to divest lands as part of their mitigation. And we applied to be one of those recipients of some of our ancestral landscapes. And that process took until 2019, when we were awarded our first parcel, and we just closed on our last parcel, totaling 6 different parcels on about 3,000 acres last month. And so it's been a very, very long process. And now we are shifting from that fight, that battle, that struggle to regain some of our ancestral homelands into tending them and building the capacity of our organization. So it's a very big transition and reorganization, and that we're looking forward to doing. Within that, I wanted to share with you the idea of, is my screen sharing?
Yes, we can see it.
All right. Of processes, and processes are really important. And in the state of California and other places, we're talking about the acceleration of processes and restoration, which is very necessary. But what I found within the tribal community is that we've always existed on these landscapes. We are part of these landscapes, and we have not had the opportunity to develop the processes that are needed within our own tribal communities and organizations to engage in a meaningful way that we need to engage. And so at this time, we're asking to slow down enough to engage us in that process. And so for us, being formed the way we are currently consist of 8 different tribes and tribal organization, which is an incredible collaboration in and of itself. But we're continuing to realize that we need to collaborate with our surrounding tribes and other people. And part of the reason is each family has a family history. They have family burials, they have ceremonial sites, they have gathering sites that they still tend to this day. They have their spiritual places that they go. And if we leave one person out or one tribe out of that conversation, we could destroy and lose knowledge that one person may be the only carrier of today. So along that line, we're asking that agencies and organizations that we work with and that continually ask to partner us to change their process. And that's to line item, put a budget item in for every project that they're doing, so that we as tribal organizations and tribes can build a department that way to engage the way that they're asking us to do. Because right now it's completely volunteer, and our time is we're in such demand that we don't have the time to do it the way that we need to do it, to vet our communities. And it may take several months in order to do that. And I'll explain later how that can look. But back to processes, and processes for us are can be broken down into the non-human and the human processes. And the non-human forms were here before, in our creation stories, before human beings came into this world, and they function of and by themselves without us. And when we came into this world, we were told to know everything that existed before us, and that we were totally dependent on those things, and we had a responsibility to those things through that dependency for food, for shelter, for water, for the air we breathe. And being one of the human people that we are, we also have a responsibility to optimize their living conditions and their levels. And so part of the processes are knowing our landscapes. And all of the pictures in this presentation are original photos by myself, well, except with one exception. But I chose a winter photo and a summer or spring photo because the seasons are incredibly important in knowing the seasonality of the place that you live in and how that affects water, how that affects winds, how that affects all of the plants and biodiversity is really a very important part of the process. And then branches of beings and human beings, and all of the beings in our world are a being. They can be a rock being, a tree being, Hamsi Chon Maidu, as seen in the picture, an acorn tree. They might be Pacunum Maidu, a mountain lion, or Mudim Maidu, a black bear, as you see the footprints in this photo. And they're all beings, and we have a responsibility to them through understanding and being present in those places. And then that understanding of what was here before us, but how are we as human beings today, and how are we going to be with each other, and how are we going to continue to be with each other? Part of our human history is maybe reflective of some of the degradation to our environment right now. And we're in a time that, as has cycled continually, of some really brilliant understandings, and then some not so brilliant and even incredibly damaging events. And so one of the things that I came up with several years ago, about 10 or 12 years ago, was gathering together to gather together. And as you see, here is a mortar. This is an ancient mortar from I don't know how many thousands of years ago in one of our upper areas of our homelands. And this was used to process food sources. And in order to survive and to live on an environment without imports and exports of food and other materials, you had to know that environment very intimately, and your life really did depend on it. And then our bulbs, our meadow plants and things were some of the things that we processed in those mortars that were really, really important together. And so the idea of gathering together to gather together was about our food sources, the materials that we need. But in today's world, we're not as dependent on those. We still eat them and process them to some degree, but we are absolutely not completely dependent. But human beings, we still love to gather together. And one of the ways that we can do that is to be present next to that mortar, or in that camas field, or that onion field, and understand the water cycles and the nutrients and their role in the environment. And if we can, in our creation story, we were told to know these things. And if we learn these things, we will always know ourselves and always know our pathway. And that goes into some of the restoration activities that we've engaged in. One of the things that I started about in 2012 was to have a gathering in place with all of the stakeholders of that place. So the county government, conservation organizations, academia, tribal elders, youth. And so we had a 3-day seminar about traditional ecological knowledge in one of my matriarchal homeland places. And it was incredible. And it just changed their whole viewpoint. And at that point, my dad had been a logger all of his life, and he was very adversarial to the U.S. Forest Service for some good reasons and some not so good reasons. But then forest supervisor came up and introduced himself and sat next to my dad. And my dad kind of looked at him and he said, "Well, you guys are the reason this is such a mess." And the supervisor just immediately was like, "Yes. And that's why we're here, to help fix it." And they became very good friends very quickly. And so those relationships are incredibly important in the work that we all do. And those relationships to place, to each other, and then the tribal processes. And so that's one of the things that as tribal communities, we're really struggling to find words to break down that process, slow it down enough to find ways to really engage us in the way that we need to, and bring forward these other relationships and values, knowledge. And so this leads into process-based restoration, and that is a little bit more reflective of our methodology. And so we've had the opportunity to work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Occidental Arts and Ecology on some meadow restoration projects using beaver dam analogs. And in the photo, you can see a beaver dam analog that survived the Dixie Fire. In the last 4 years, we've had about 80% of our ancestral homelands burned. Last year, the Dixie Fire burned approximately 960,000 acres in our homelands and part of the Pitt River homelands. And this is really not acceptable to us, and we feel like it's a choice that humanity has made to not have a relationship with fire and to place. And fire in and of itself can be an incredible restorer and is undervalued. And so in the background, you see the burnt forest, and the burning of the meadow was a very beneficial thing. But as you're looking at that beaver dam analog, before that was built, you could see cut banks. The water wasn't nearly as wide. And so it's re-wetting the entire meadow system and putting water back into a system, holding it for longer into the season, and creating so many benefits to both the ecosystem and for human usage. And the Upper Feather River watershed that we reside in, 27 million Californians depend on our water source. We use this water. And so when people talk about rural communities and how people shouldn't live there and there shouldn't be a need for investment, it's like, well, who do you think stewards these places to the best of our ability within the confines of legislation, laws, policies, and budgets? It's the people that live here, not just the tribal communities, but all of us. And so the other photo is my Uncle Ben, and a lot of helpers, and you can see how happy they are getting out there and doing these builds. And it's a great bonding experience. And also we see it as rebuilding our relationships with place. When you get people out there without heavy equipment and dozers to do restoration, and they're doing hands-on and maybe chainsaws and some chains and some hammers or something, and using the materials right there, it's an incredible experience and it's transformational. So those are some of the things that I wanted to share with you today. And the Maidu Summit Consortium is organized as a tribal nonprofit. Our board is all Mountain Maidu, and at this time, all of our employees are Mountain Maidu. But we're looking to recruit more help. And if you'd like to find more about us or contact us, you can go to maidusummit.org. And there's also a donation button if you'd like to donate by monetary, which we always appreciate. And we're also trying to compile a team of experts post Dixie Fire to be able to help people or find a way to engage a lot of the volunteers and technical expertise that people have offered to us. So thank you again for this opportunity today.
Thank you so much, Trina, for that wonderful presentation and for being here today. And next, we're going to move west out of the mountains and into the Lower American River and hear from Jessica Law, Executive Director of the Water Forum. So I'll turn it over to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Katie. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me. Hang on, let me pull up my presentation for a second. That takes me a minute. And let's see. Are you all seeing the notes or are you seeing the other version?
Now we're seeing the notes.
All right, let me switch. How about now?
Yeah, there we go.
We're good? Okay. All right. Okay. Well, thanks so much for having me here. It's great to come and talk about the Water Forum and the work that we do. I'm going to focus today on, and I love the title for this, which is, resiliency from the ground up. We're going to talk a little bit about the Water Forum and our role and how we build resiliency from the ground up and how we're working on the Lower American River to protect our water supply and the fishery and habitat of the Lower American River. So the Lower American River, hopefully some of you have been there and have gone out and played on it. The Lower American River winds through the Sacramento region and connects with the Sacramento River in the capital of the state, so in Sacramento. For those of you who might be here for the Aqua Conference this week, I hope, if you're from out of town, I hope you get a chance to come out and see the American River. There's lots of parks and an extensive parkway where the entire city and region really comes to play. So the Water Forum itself, we are a group of diverse business and agricultural leaders, citizen groups, environmentalists, water managers, and local governments. And the Water Forum has been coming together for almost 30 years now to work on regional water supply reliability and then also protect the health of the Lower American River. So I'm going to talk a lot today about governance, which is, a very important part of the work that we do and often sort of not really talked about that much. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about sort of the structures, the processes, the partnerships, the stakeholders that we have and how those relationships are critically important to get our work done. And then I'm going to tell you kind of a little bit more about our secret sauce and how we've been able to be successful over the past 30 years and how we're using that now in order to look at the future and really try and build resiliency for the region. So let's talk more about our work. The Memorandum of Understanding for the Water Forum Agreement. Okay, the Water Forum is a voluntary agreement that has been in place since April 24th, 2000. So just a little over 22 years. And the Water Forum, there's 7 elements of the Water Forum Agreement. It focuses on water conservation, dry year actions, groundwater management, a flow standard for the Lower American River, habitat management, and then water supply diversions. This agreement came into place when there was a tremendous amount of conflict in the region over growth in Sacramento County and the city of Sacramento. Some of you may remember the debate about the Auburn Dam. And really, this is a fundamental debate about how we use water supplies on the American River. The Water Forum was developed over 7 years through an interest-based negotiation process. We'll talk about that a little bit more, where 4 caucuses came together to represent business, water, environment, and then civic interests. Those caucuses still exist today. And are very active in both implementation of the original Water Forum Agreement and then also in developing and revising and renegotiating a new agreement to look really towards the future. So I'm going to talk about 3 program areas today. We've got a lot going on, but these are really sort of our top 3. I'm going to talk about flows and operations and the science work that we do to support decision-making on the Lower American River and Folsom Reservoir. I'm going to talk about habitat enhancement and show you a project that we did last year. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Water Forum 2.0 and what we're doing to create sustainability in this region. Okay, flow management, our flow management standard and operations. So as a part of the Water Forum Agreement that was signed in 2000, there was an acknowledgement and a strong emphasis on the need to manage flows in the Lower American River, including both local diversions and then also to work with the Bureau of Reclamation, who operates the CVP and operates Folsom Dam, and to work closely with those interests to protect storage at Folsom Reservoir, and also to protect the Lower American River and support fisheries health. So the Water Forum worked very carefully, and starting in 2006, published a flow management standard that intends to balance both of those objectives, water supply and fisheries health. That flow management standard has been modified, improved upon, and has changed based on best available science and really practice of implementing that flow management standard in the region. So at this point, we have a flow management standard that was published in, well, we really started working on it and issued it in 2017. And then in 2019, it was incorporated in the biological opinions and is really the basis for operations of Folsom and the Lower American River right now. Of course, over the past few years, we have experienced extreme drought, not just in this region or in the state, but throughout the West. And the Water Forum is working closely with Reclamation and other state and federal agencies to implement the flow management standard and really understand how to support decision-making, excuse me, at critical times throughout the year, to focus on, you know, whether or not spring pulse flows are needed, whether or not we can reach, you know, certain temperature management standards, and how to use Folsom Dam to the best to support both water supply and power generation and fisheries during the fall when it's hot and there's not a lot of water left. So, you know, the past year or two have been really challenging in terms of water supply and water supply operations. And again, we're in a really interesting place this year. Folsom Reservoir itself is at above average levels, which unfortunately is not the case throughout the state. So there's a lot of pressure on Folsom this year. There's also a lot of pressure on the fisheries, and we're working closely with the state and federal agencies to support decision-making on flows. So that's a very short snippet about the flow management standard and what's involved there. Let me talk a little bit about our habitat enhancement program. Obviously, we're here to talk about habitat and what it takes. The Water Forum has been working over the past 10 or 12 years to get habitat projects in the ground. The majority of our funding comes from the Bureau of Reclamation through the CVPIA, Central Valley Improvement Act program, and supports implementing spawning and rearing habitat enhancements on the Lower American River. This work cannot be done without our partners. We are considered the local partner for Bureau of Reclamation to implement these projects. So we do a little bit of everything from, actually all of everything, which is, you know, from design, implementation, construction with all of these partners to get the projects in the ground, and then also outreach and communications. And it's just such tremendous work. It's really fun. And I invite you, if you're in the area, we usually are doing projects. Let's see, we've been doing projects pretty much every year, every other year. Last year, we were at Ansel Hoffman Park in the Parkway, and worked very closely with the Effion Nature Center as we were doing a habitat project at that location. So we had lots of fun and did a tremendous amount of education and tours. These are some pictures from that project last year. We do our own, you know, we work closely with the agencies on water quality monitoring. And then, of course, you can see the woody habitat that's getting put into the river. Hang on, I got some more pictures here. Let's see. So just a little bit of background on CVPIA. The work that we do is funded through the Restoration Fund and is, you know, a really important part of the work that we do. Here are 10 sites that, this is a map of the Lower American River. It's the upper 10 miles of the Lower American River. And you can see on this map, we've got both our borrow areas where we're removing gravel from the river or sorting gravel from the river, and then areas where we're doing restoration. And then this is just, I just want to show quickly, this is the Ansel Hoffman project site that we completed last year. So before, you can see there was an existing spawning riffle that was right here, some gravel in the river, and then a small sort of side channel. We went in and did a tremendous amount of excavation of gravel that had built up in this area, replaced it in the river to create a much larger spawning riffle, and then a side channel that fills in at higher flows and creates rearing habitat. And habitat success. We started the project last July, and it was complete by basically we go from Memorial Day to Labor Day in terms of construction prep, and then by the time that steelhead were starting to come in, we had some of the first. You can see on this side there are salmon reds that are in the river. This was the first site on the Lower American River where steelhead reds were observed, which is just really exciting. The fact that we're getting out there, we're building projects within 5 or 6 weeks to support salmon, and almost immediately we see a response from the fisheries. So let me take a second there and just switch gears. So just to recap a little bit, the Water Forum, the work that we do throughout the region, the flows and operations work that we do with the Bureau of Reclamation and other state and federal agencies to support their decision-making on fulsome operations is really a critical aspect of our work. And it goes hand in hand with the habitat work that we are doing to enhance spawning and rearing habitat on the Lower American River. We also do work with local organizations, whether it's FE Nature Center or Sac Valley Conservancy or Soil-Borne Farms, to both try and enhance their education programs. And then also we have a few side channel restoration projects. One that we've done at Cordova Creek, if any of you are familiar with this local area. And then also, we're looking at other opportunities to really try and enhance that network of streams and channels that are coming into the Lower American River. So obviously a lot more to talk about here, but let me keep zooming forward and talk about Water Forum 2.0. We have an agreement that's been in place for 20 years. The agreement expires in 2030. And because it took 7 years to negotiate the original agreement, about 2 years ago, we got started on a renegotiation of the agreement, knowing that with the Water Forum structure, with all of the complex issues that are in place, it's going to be really important to give ourselves enough time to dig into the details and really have those conversations and give ourselves space and time for the negotiation. So we are about 2 years into this process of Water Forum 2.0. And I want to talk a little bit about that process itself and kind of what I see as the secret sauce, what makes it successful, not just this process, but the Water Forum overall. Our focus in this agreement is really around climate resiliency. And the way that we've gotten here has been through extensive conversation and discussion and learning really over the last 2 years. So this is just a very sort of simplified version of the process that we've been taking, but working through an amazing facilitation team, working with individual caucuses, and then as a whole, the plenary as a whole, which is all the 4 caucuses coming together. The Water Forum has been moving through these stages of the negotiation process. So the first stage was really a foundational stage to make sure that we understand what we were getting into, laying the structure, laying the principles, educating ourselves about the important issues, and then forming and reforming the caucuses to strengthen those that are at the table. The phase 1, which was really last year, and again, these things overlap, it's a very iterative process, really focusing on our goals and our objectives. Where do we want to go? What are the core interests of each of the caucuses? What's the desired outcome that we want to get to? And then starting to dig into a little bit of technical analysis. We are currently in phase 2, which is we're digging in a bit more on learning and engagement, understanding how the system works, understanding aspects of social equity and environmental justice and how that plays into our work, and a whole host of other topics, looking at groundwater, looking at conjunctive use possibility, looking at demand management and conservation, and really trying to take these areas where we understand that there's emerging areas of agreement and understand where there's areas of divergence, kind of breaking down the areas of agreement and saying, and here's how we're going to move forward with these in our, in places like under flows and operations and habitat enhancement, and then really starting to identify and dig into the places where we have a divergence of opinions, where we need to spend more time talking and negotiating, and then of course evaluating potential solutions. So I just want to say that the next phase is getting to negotiation, but just to make a comment here that we're spending 2 years really understanding the structure and how we talk about these issues and why they're important, and where not just the positions of individual members of organizations, but as a whole, how are these caucuses coming together and negotiating? So we're doing all of this work before we even get to the negotiations. It is a very careful process. It's a very detailed process. And, I think it's, I told you I was going to tell you what our secret sauce is. The secret sauce really in all of this is implementing interest-based negotiations and interest-based negotiation principles. And there's sort of 4 principles that are really important in our work, and really in all interest-based negotiations. 1, separating people from the problem. 2, focusing on interests rather than positions. 3, generating a variety of options before settling, right? So that's where we are now. We're really looking at the entire landscape and perspective of what's going to be important before we start negotiating the details. And then insisting that this agreement be based on objective criteria and best available science. And that's really our secret sauce. I have to say, it's just a tremendous organization. I've been here for a little over a year, and the thing that keeps me coming back to the Water Forum and our members coming back to the Water Forum is that this is a group of individuals and organizations that are so passionate about the region. They want to be able to protect the resources, balance the competing interests, and again and again, committing to the region's sustainability and a resilient future. So I invite you to learn more at waterforum.org, or you're always welcome to get in touch with me. And that's it. Katie, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica, for that wonderful presentation. And I am writing down some of your secret sauce notes here because we can always use those in our work as well. And now next, we are going to make our way to the coast, which is getting a lot of attention lately. And it's time to hear from Evan Sloan, a Deputy Regional Manager at the San Francisco Bay region of the State Coastal Conservancy. Let's see.
Thank you, Katie. Can you hear me?
Sure, I can hear you.
All right, let me try to share my screen. Doesn't look like I'm freezing just yet. How's that?
Good.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. I'm Evan Sloan, the Deputy Regional Manager, as Katie just mentioned, of the Coastal Conservancy San Francisco Bay program. I was asked to share what brought me to this work, and it did all start with a wetland ecology class at the University of San Francisco as an undergrad many years ago. That class included many field trips to wetlands across the San Francisco estuary. I knew then the importance of wetlands and the threats they face with climate change, but also their incredible natural defense to those impacts. From there, I worked on several research projects and labs at San Francisco State with Tom Parker and Mike Vasey, and USF with John Calloway, studying the impacts of climate change on San Francisco Bay's tidal wetlands, along a salinity gradient into the Delta, as well as monitoring restored salt ponds in the South Bay. I later went to grad school studying climate change impacts on submerged aquatic vegetation in Sassoon Bay in the Delta with Kathy Boyer at San Francisco State's Estuary and Ocean Science Center. I'm lucky to now work at the Coastal Conservancy, where I can help implement projects that are trying to combat the impacts of climate change and provide resilience to coastal and bay communities. At the Coastal Conservancy, I was in the South Coast program for the past 7 years, and now I'm happy to be back in the Bay. So my talk today will focus on examples from both Southern California as well as San Francisco Bay. First, the Coastal Conservancy is a state agency established in 1976. We fund and facilitate coastal habitat restoration and public access projects along the entire coast, as well as in coastal watersheds, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and in the Santa Ana River watershed. Our jurisdiction includes 75% of California's population. And most importantly, we are a collaborative agency working together with others, whether that be local governments, nonprofits, academics, consultants, and many state and federal agencies to get our projects in the ground. And while we've been restoring coastal habitats and increasing public access across the state for decades, the work is getting harder due to the growing impacts of climate change. Today, we are already seeing flood damage to communities, a loss of low-lying shoreline roads, parks, and trails, and a loss of coastal and estuarine habitats. That's where living shorelines can come in. Living shorelines are essentially just coastal habitat restoration projects that have been designed and monitored for their physical benefits as well as their biological benefits. We also call them nature-based adaptation solutions. In some cases, these are the habitat restoration projects we have always been implementing with some specific design considerations for sea level rise resilience. And in other cases, these are new innovative projects utilizing habitat types to attenuate waves and reduce erosion and flooding. There is a huge range of habitats that can be included in a living shoreline project, from the outer coast along beaches to inside many of our bays and estuaries in California. In low energy environments, or what I just called the inner coast, meaning the bays and estuaries along California, a big focus for climate resiliency is restoring wetland habitats. Within wetlands, there is an elevation gradient of habitat types that can be included. In the subtidal zone, oysters, eelgrass, seaweeds, rock, and mudflats can all be included in living shoreline projects. In fact, in California, the term living shoreline first became popularized from a few oyster and eelgrass projects, but there are actually many more habitat types that can be included. Other habitat types that can be included in an estuarine living shoreline project includes salt marsh vegetation and upland habitats. The ecological and physical processes that take place when a system contains all of these habitats across the elevation gradient really is what provides the most resilience in a system. These wetland habitat types along the elevation gradient are critical to a holistic nature-based approach due to their large number of services. Wetlands are home for hundreds of fish and wildlife species. They filter pollutants. They provide outdoor recreational opportunities, sequester carbon, and provide flood protection by reducing wave energy to help adapt to sea level rise. The Coastal Conservancy is leading several estuarine living shoreline projects across the state, including one in Upper Newport Bay, another in San Diego Bay, one in Santa Monica Bay, and several in San Francisco Bay. In San Francisco Bay, the first living shoreline project started in 2010, testing the use of native oyster and eelgrass restoration for shoreline protection benefits. These projects have been carefully designed and monitored to test their effectiveness at shoreline protection, as well as their biological benefits. Over time, these projects have built upon the monitoring results, learning from each phase, and slowly increasing in scale and the number of habitat types. Now we are implementing living shoreline projects in the Bay that include native oyster reefs, eelgrass restoration, tidal wetlands, coarse beaches, and rocky intertidal species. One of those San Francisco Bay living shoreline projects that has expanded to include multiple habitat types along the elevation gradient is the Giant Marsh Living Shoreline Project in Richmond, California. This project design was completed in fall of 2016 and includes 7 different habitat treatments that range from oyster reef and eelgrass plantings, seaweed treatments, and tidal, marsh, and upland ecotone components. There are 3 different oyster reefs in the design, each paired with a different vegetative component: eelgrass, Pacific rockweed, and Pacific cordgrass. They are sited at different tidal heights and shoreline orientations and different reef types and materials. The California eelgrass, rockweed, and sea blight plantings were installed in 2019, and in January 2022, they installed Spartina and over 1,000 ecotone plants. In high wave energy environments, some great elements have been included in outer coast living shoreline projects in California. The Army Corps of Engineers, along with several other federal agencies, developed this green to gray spectrum of coastal protection options. On the fully green side, that would include pure habitat restoration with no structures that wouldn't normally be found in the system. On the gray side, those features would not provide habitat or support coastal processes due to severing the land and water interface. In the middle, you can see where some of our living shoreline projects fall on the outer coast. The Coastal Conservancy is leading several outer coast living shoreline projects across the state as well. I will highlight one in San Diego called the Cardiff Living Shoreline Project. The Cardiff Living Shoreline Project lowered and buried the rock revetment along Highway 1, as you can see on the left, and built a novel hybrid sand, cobble, rock, dune design planted with native vegetation, as you can see just after construction on the right. The dune habitat was restored on top and in front of the rock and included a native cobble toe to further dissipate wave energy. Marching through time, here's another photo from October 2019 on the left. As you can see, the southern half was vegetated after the northern half due to construction activity timing. On the right is another photo from February 2020, where more native vegetation has recruited. Continuing through time, on the left, you can see the northern section with 3 panels from January 2021, September 2021, and January 2022. And same on the right for the southern section. As you can see, the vegetation has continued to increase in density throughout time, with the southern half continuing to be sparser than the northern. Even with the southern end included in 2021, the project surpassed its reference sites in terms of vegetation cover. Here are some more photos of habitat and public access components from the project. This project is currently being monitored for its physical and biological benefits and just finished its 3rd year of monitoring. The sparse vegetation in the southern half continues to be great habitat for plover, which is a good sign as well. Now going back to tidal wetlands, in both Southern California and San Francisco Bay, wetland restoration has been identified as a critical need, with quantitative restoration objectives set at 22,000 additional acres for San Francisco Bay and 7,700 additional acres in Southern California. However, the need for action is now. Complex and large-scale coastal wetland restoration projects take 10 to 20 years from initial planning to implementation. Once implemented, it may take several additional decades for the wetland to evolve into a fully functioning wetland system. The most recent sea level rise projections suggest that the rate of sea level rise will increase markedly after 2050, resulting in a near doubling of the rate by 2100. Considering that restoration can take up to 20 years after completion to achieve a fully functioning coastal wetland, restoration projects should be completed by 2030 in order to establish mature marshes by 2050. If the ultimate aim is to establish resilient vegetated marshes by 2050, such planning needs to begin immediately to be realized within this timeframe. After that, there are additional strategies to increase resilience, like reconnecting restored wetlands to their watersheds, purchasing inland land and restoring upland habitats for future migration space, and realigning adjacent infrastructure to accommodate wetlands. Wetland restoration centered on resiliency needs a focus on space and sediment. In the near term, we can increase sediment accretion by mimicking natural wetland accretion processes by either placing clean dredge material on a vegetated marsh surface, which we tested in Southern California at the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge, or by strategically placing the sediment adjacent to the marsh or in slough channels and allowing the tides to naturally bring the sediment into the marsh. The Coastal Conservancy is currently planning to test that strategy in San Francisco Bay with the Army Corps of Engineers, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and the Water Board this year. Other projects are working to increase sediment accretion and habitat quality by reconnecting wetlands to their watersheds, like at the Calabasas and San Tomas Aquino Creeks to Pond A8 project in the South San Francisco Bay, which will deliver sediment to the pond from flood control channels. Now we need to continue what we've been doing, connecting people to nature, working on collaborative projects and restoring wetlands, but with more focus on resilience and more focus on equity. One large-scale project, multi-benefit project working to protect an underserved community is the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline Phase 1 project. The Shoreline project is constructing approximately 4 miles of levee, shown in red on this project map, that would tie into existing flood protection projects on the Guadalupe River and Coyote Creek. The thicker yellow line shows the proposed upland transition zones that the project will build next to the levee. Additionally, the project will provide enhanced public access with new bay trail connections in the region, as well as restore approximately 3,000 acres of tidal wetlands. Those ponds are shown in blue. The project will manage flood risk for 5,500 residents and 1,100 structures in the adjacent San Jose area, including the underserved community of Alviso. Alviso is deeply subsided, in some places up to 10 feet below sea level, because of historic groundwater pumping, making the community highly vulnerable to coastal flooding and sea level rise today and in the future. The project also includes construction of an ecotone, which is a vegetated buffer area between the tidal marsh and uplands that will provide refuge during storms or high tides. The salt marsh harvest mouse and other wetland species will benefit from the creation of this high tide refugia. Additionally, the ecotone will provide some sea level rise resilience, allowing the tidal marsh to migrate upslope as sea levels rise. Construction just started on this project in December 2021. In summary, what can we do as the conservation community to address sea level rise? We can acquire land from willing sellers, especially in inland areas, to allow for wetland migration. We can build relationships and trust in communities. We can connect watersheds to baylands to increase sediment inputs. We can address legacy pollution in urban areas, increase the scale and habitat types in living shoreline projects, strategically place sediment, restore coastal habitats now, and adapt public access to meet community needs. There are many planning documents addressing resiliency in the state and region right now. The Coastal Conservancy is currently building off these efforts in our current strategic planning process. Given our recent influx of coastal resilience funding and our current strategic plan ending this year, we are updating our strategic plan for 2023 to 2028. We have already done a kickoff webinar for this planning process, which you can access the recording of on our website. We are currently underway with several regional meetings, tribal outreach, board meeting discussions, surveys, and a public comment period. If you would like to participate, you can fill out our survey and add your project ideas to our map on our website at scc.ca.gov/about/plan. We hope the final plan will be done by December of this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. Let's see here. And now that you all have heard about these restoration projects that are helping make California more resilient to the effects of climate change, you may be wondering, what is sustainable conservation doing to help accelerate these projects? And for over 20 years, our Accelerating Restoration program has been working on policy and regulatory incentives, bringing together agencies and restoration proponents to make permitting approvals faster and easier so that more of these important projects can get implemented faster and at a lower cost. And given Sustainable Conservation's extensive experience with accelerating restoration, we're also in a unique position to be able to assist the Resources Agency and other state agencies with implementing the new Cutting the Green Tape initiative. One of the things we're currently doing is preparing programmatic permits, which are approvals negotiated in advance to cover restoration projects similar to the ones described in this panel here. Just for reference, a recent Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC, report showed that programmatic permits for restoration projects, just with one agency, the National Marine Fisheries Service, has saved $5 to $13 million over the years that they have been in place, and have increased. We've also seen that the programmatic permits can increase permitting speeds for an agency tenfold. So what used to take maybe 160 hours now takes 16 hours, since an entirely new permit does not need to be negotiated and written for each new project seeking approval. Let's see. It also takes, it takes a big upfront investment to develop programmatic permits, and not all agencies have the capacity to develop useful permits on their own. So that's where sustainable conservation comes in. We help draft technical materials, coordinate input from project proponents and agencies, all while making sure the development of these permits stays a high priority amongst agency staff and decision makers. We've learned that it's not enough just to have the permits in place as well. We also need to have dedicated outreach to make sure people know the permits are available, and project proponents know the permits are available and how to use them. Therefore, we also provide free permitting technical assistance to project proponents. We conduct webinars, presentations at conferences, agency staff training. We're in the process of developing a website for permits and more. For those of you who may be interested in talking to us about your restoration project and learning more about these permitting pathways, we suggest you go to our technical resources page. That's suscon.org/technical resources. I think Hannah might put that in the chat. There you'll find more information about permitting, how to contact us for technical assistance, how to sign up for our Accelerating Restoration email newsletter to get updates specifically about your program. And you'll also be alerted when the latest permits that we're working on are available for use. So with that, I'd like to just open it up to some Q&A with the panelists here. For those who are watching, feel free to put some questions in the chat if you have them. And I also have some questions that we can kick things off with. So yeah, if the panelists wouldn't mind coming back, turn their cameras back on, they're getting ready for questions. And just to kind of kick things off here, let's see, this one may be for Evan, but anyone is welcome to chime in. We've seen there's the Federal Infrastructure Jobs Act that was passed last year. Recently, the San Francisco Bay has got a big uptick in funding. I believe it's about $24 million in fiscal year 2022 coming down the pike. And the governor's budget had quite a bit in there for climate resiliency as well. So I'm just wondering, how are your organizations responding to these increases in funding? How is it affecting your work? And anything you can share about that. So I don't know who wants to jump in.
Start with that, because
Okay.
that's where my presentation was ending. So we have these huge pots of money coming our way right now. And so we knew that we needed to do a strategic planning process so that we could identify our own priorities as well as the priorities in the communities we're working in and with our stakeholders. We're not done with that process, so I can't say what our priorities are per se, but we do know we want to focus on moving the needle with some of the larger projects that can get stuck because of funding issues. So those are our really large scale, complicated projects that, have many different partners working on them, are filled with different pieces of infrastructure from our landscape, whether that's PG&E towers, railroads, wastewater treatment facilities, all sorts of infrastructure that can really complicate projects, right? So we do really want to move the needle on some of our large projects. We want everything to focus on resilience. We want to make sure that all the projects we're investing in are helping increase our resilience, especially to sea level rise and wildfire. We do have a wildfire program now in our agency, so we're going to be continuing with that. And then we need to focus on equity. So that's a big part that's going to be coming from our strategic planning process. We're hosting a number of workshops and one-on-one interviews, and really trying to hear from communities in terms of what the barriers are for them to receive our funding, what the needs are of their communities for resilience. And then hopefully with all of this money, we can really start addressing those issues.
Great, thank you. Evan, does anyone else want to chime in on that, or?
Yeah, I'd like to chime in. For us in the Upper Feather River, the Maidu Summit Consortium is a tribal community, but we also partner with almost everybody in our organization or in our watershed through the IRWM that really worked to convene everybody in our watershed, from agriculture, municipal water sources, timber and industry, meadows, and then the Plumas County Fire Safe Council has also been a huge collaboration point. And so in response to the Dixie Fire, specifically with nearly 1 million acres burned, much of that being timberland. And so the effects of carbon sequestration and climate impacts, erosion issues, warming water supplies, sedimentation issues. We're positioned well with collaborations, but we don't have the workforce that we need. So all of a sudden this money's coming in and we're like, whoa, we've been waiting. And it's kind of like the Maidu Summit Consortium. We worked so hard to get this land, and now it's like, oh, now we get to take care of it. And I feel like our watershed and our partnership collaborations are feeling the same way. It's like, okay, we've been working so hard, and now we need to figure out how to build our capacity workforce and personnel along with the technical expertise. So there's people that can help us at that larger scale do that statewide. I know that there'd be deep appreciation for that, and it would serve the entire state.
Thank you, Trina. Yeah, it sounds like capacity that, more funding also brings its own set of challenges with it that that folks need to adapt to. So thank you for that perspective. Mm-hmm. Jessica, did you want to chime in?
Sure, I can just add in a little bit just to echo what Evan and Trina are saying, where we are in a great place where there is a tremendous amount of state and federal funding coming through, and I think there's just an amazing opportunity. The Water Forum, especially on our Habitat Enhancement program, we've been building those projects. It's been sort of every year, every other year as funding has been available. But now there's really a very large block of funding. We have about 13 million to implement projects over the next 5 years. So we're implementing projects double time, and we are pursuing programmatic permits. And the work that Sustainable Conservation is doing is definitely helping us out. So thank you, we appreciate it. But there's always, this is definitely a capacity issue where even, from the scale of construction, our construction crew is the Department of Utilities at City of Sacramento. They are an amazing crew. They love doing this work. It's their favorite project to implement every year, but we only get them for about 5 or 6 weeks in the summer. So if we go from one project to 2 projects, we either have to bid it out or we have to really negotiate with them and make sure that we've got their time and that it's scheduled out far in advance. So there is definitely a capacity issue that we're seeing, not just in our region, but really throughout the system. There's only so many bulldozers around to rent. And so, there's a lot of demands on just the logistics of it, the crews, the equipment, all of that. And that's definitely an important thing. I'd say also in terms of capacity, we do have some funding for science and monitoring and adaptive management, but this is a really important aspect of the work that we do, where you need to continue to look at what you're doing, to look at how the projects are behaving and performing, and go back and be able to do adaptive management. So to the extent that there is state and federal funding to get projects in the ground, we also need to make sure that there's state and federal funding for the science, the monitoring, long-term monitoring, and the adaptive management.
Thank you, Jessica. Really appreciate that insight too. I mean, there's, we want to accelerate things, obviously, through accelerate the the permitting part, but once it gets to implementation, there are some limitations just in terms of actual boots on the ground and pieces of construction equipment to get the work done, and also months of the year, right? Because typically you're confined to working during certain times of the year to be protective of all the many threatened and endangered species throughout the state. So there's a lot of different constraints going on there. Let's see, I'll pose another question here. What are some of the barriers to getting your projects done, or what are some of the biggest barriers that, as you see it, and how might we work to better advance your projects? So I want to step in on that first.
I'll go first this time. And I kind of outlined the barriers in my presentation, but so again, the processes, and for us, tribally, there have been laws and policies enacted that have kept us from enacting our cultural practices and tribal knowledge, and so that need to really figure out a different way for tribes to engage. It's both a legal obligation, but it's also the right thing to do, and that thousands of years of practice in place, that knowledge, what we still retain of it, how do we bring that forward? And it's not like you don't call Trina Cunningham as the executive director and ask her to share everything for the whole community. There has to be a process to engage a whole community. And so so that's a barrier. And then again, the capacity issues and the permitting is, we have these properties, and then when we're looking at landscape scale projects, the different ownerships and different jurisdictions and different funding sources, and just those collaborations of how do we work with the U.S. Forest Service that owns nearly 70% of the watershed, and then how does the state come into that with the state water supplies, and finding those nexuses. And it is happening, and I've been very encouraged with the Water Forum and some of the work that's happening there and in other areas. But those are some of our barriers.
Yeah, I'll chime in as well. I think there's several barriers for nature-based solutions. One is that it's still, even though it seems like we've been talking about it for a while, it's still a relatively new concept. And to implement these projects for physical protection benefits, in addition to the biological, that can be difficult to convince a landowner or local government or whoever's trying to protect an area, because engineers are working on those projects, and they know the hard infrastructure ways to protect, and their engineering can stamp approval of designs and say, yes, this will protect it for X amount of years. And that's more difficult to say with nature-based solutions. And so we've been trying to pilot projects across the state and try to show a variety of materials and a variety of habitat types and skills to give, the local entities trying to protect an area that information. But again, it's very site specific. And so it can be difficult. So that is definitely a barrier. And I think we need to build capacity in terms of education, but also workforce development. We don't have very many people working on these projects. The number of consulting firms that we can hire to help design these types of projects is very limited. So there's a lot that needs to be done on that front. And then in addition to that, and along the same lines is the regulatory process, which we keep speaking to. And really the current regulatory environment is really incentivizing gray infrastructure. It's much easier for an entity to go in and build a seawall above the water line and not have to get a number of permits and or maintenance. A lot of ports and cities and all sorts of entities can just continue to maintain and build up kind of their gray infrastructure. the Army Corps of Engineers did create a living shoreline programmatic permit nationwide 54, which has been used once in California. But the requirements of that permit are actually, they were basically developed for the East Coast. So it doesn't have the same characteristics and needs that we have for living shoreline projects. So there definitely needs to be more programmatic permits and maybe some changes to the one that has been made so far. And I can go on and on, honestly, so I should probably stop there.
Thank you. Jessica, did you want to chime in at all on that one, or?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think I talked about some of the constraints just in terms of logistics and equipment. There's, and Evan's speaking to this, which is just there's a very strong fabric of existing regulatory and bureaucratic process that does emphasize gray infrastructure and gray infrastructure solutions. And so, I think all of us, you have to be more creative, you have to be faster, you have to be innovative. But, there's a few things. We could always use more funding flexibility. I mean, that's like a major thing because things happen, right? I mean, equipment breaks down. I think COVID was a delay for us, definitely on habitat restoration. So we could always use funding flexibility in terms of time frame. But I would just say the things that help move it forward, and Katie, stop me if this is your next question, but the things that really help move it forward are partnerships, having advocates at state and federal agencies that are really pushing and trying to get these things moving, and understand that you got to work around that sort of existing fabric to get stuff done. So, yeah.
Great, thank you, Jessica, for that. And just to put it, we had one comment come in through the chat about Trina in her presentation mentioned tribes are looking to slow down and really take a thorough look at how to solve problems, as I understand it. And our program is about accelerating restoration, But one thing, a finer note I wanted to make there is we're looking at accelerating the bureaucratic processes and the sort of the paperwork part of approving projects. But there's still a step for pre-application consultation. There's still opportunity to outreach to the community and stakeholders. And so it's really just a lot of the work is done up front in planning projects and designing projects. So then when you get to the actual permitting step, that's what gets accelerated. And another thing we're doing to help with the acceleration is we are working collaboratively with several different state and federal agencies to make their permit conditions consistent so that an applicant or a project proponent doesn't get conflicting requirements between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, let's say, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. We're doing things like that to help accelerate restoration. But in terms of the design and the engagement with the public, that takes on its own life and its own process and is kind of a separate topic. So I just wanted to clarify that. Let's see, we probably have time for one more question here. I would say, let's see, we could pull something for any audience. Any last questions? Get them in the chat right now. Otherwise, I'll pull one up here. This audience member says, with all the challenges and barriers, what keeps you going and what gives you hope? So any panelists want to jump in on that one? Because it's true, it's challenging work, but it's also rewarding. So who wants to speak on that?
I mean, for me, it's really going to the sites once we get a project in the ground. Every project I've worked on, once it's in place, it has so many different benefits, right? Almost all of our projects have some sort of public access component, a new trail, a new boardwalk, a new education center, and then there's the habitat, and then there's the protection, the recreation. So every time I go to a project, I get inspired. And also the collaboration, even though there are all these barriers, the people I'm working with in a room, which there's so many different organizations in the room, have the same goal. right? And we all want to get the project done. We want to provide the most resilience, the most community benefits. So, working with like-minded, wonderful people with a shared goal is inspiring.
Thank you, Evan. Jessica, any thoughts on this?
Sure. Yeah. Somebody told me maybe 10 years ago, I was working on, I worked at the Delta Stewardship Council before this, and I've been working on Delta issues for about 10 years. And for those of you who work on Delta issues, it's a wicked problem. Actually, there's an entire publication about how the Delta is a wicked problem. Which is just, it feels like there isn't any progress being made, and you're having the same conversations that you had 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And the advice I got was point your toes in the right direction and then just keep walking. And I think that's advice that, I think is important, because one, it's not just me pointing my toes, it's all of us pointing our toes in the direction that we want to go in, sort of generally, as a collaboration, as a coalition, where do we want to go? And finding that North Star, finding that vision and that objective that we want to keep moving towards is so critical and takes a lot of conversation. But also that, we're walking on it together, and we're doing this together. And so that's also a really critical thing. And we make progress, and it feels slow and it's incremental, but this is really iterative work that we're doing. And so, being able to remind ourselves, yes, we are making progress. We're not just having the same conversations that we were having 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. We know so much more every single day. We know more about the system and how it works. And I think we're, just sort of that constant striving of trying to get it right is really important. So, and it's all about the people. This is all about the people. And I'm looking forward to getting back in person and seeing more people in person again. But I think, we've still made a tremendous amount of progress over the last 2 years, even with COVID. So.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Yeah, one thing I like to say is, it took 100 years or more to kind of do some of the damage we might have done, or, put in barriers to fish passage or whatever it might be. It's going to take a while to undo some of that work. So I like your advice there. Just point your toes in the right direction. Keep walking. Trina, you got any thoughts on this in terms of keeps you going?
Yes, absolutely. Every day, I pray to Creator, and it's just help open up the pathway that needs to be taken today. And within that, there's so many successes. There's so many things that if you see a beaver swimming through a river where they hadn't existed and had been eliminated for the past 100 years or 50 years, and you see a beaver there, and it's like, wow, that's so exciting. And you see a meadow blossom with plants because the water table's been increased, that hadn't grown there for a very long time. And that's super exciting. And then when you hear a person, a native person or another person speak to those plants in their own language, because as we say, language is derived from the place, and it is the language of that place. It's not the language of the people. We've only learned that. And you see the response of the plant and the trees and the water. It's phenomenal. And then really, when policies and funding change to accommodate what you're trying to achieve, and there's a mutual understanding, that also is very inspirational.
Well, thank you, Trina, and thanks all of the panelists for all of the work you do, Trina, Jessica, Evan, and for being here with us today. We really appreciate you taking the time. We've all learned so much, and I think it's been a great discussion too. So, and thank you all, everyone who tuned in today. We also appreciate your involvement and engagement in what we need to do to build a healthy and climate resilient California. Just to let you know, our next webinar in this series will be announced soon, and we'll focus on the importance of using nature-based solutions for a healthy watershed in the context of California's extreme weather. So drought, floods, and fires, which will only become more extreme with climate change. If you'd like to learn more and follow Sustainable Conservation's work, please find us on social media, subscribe to our email list, or consider a donation by visiting suscon.org/give or scanning the QR code here. Thank you again to our panelists and to everyone participating today. We look forward to having you at the next webinars. Have a good day, everyone.